Good morning. Today in this presentation we're going to learn about insulin dose adjustment. In general, we use blood sugars to guide insulin dose adjustment. As hopefully everyone knows, blood sugars typically vary, so it's vitally important not to use single readings to dose adjust. In fact, what we recommend is that you use sets of about 5 to 10 readings to guide insulin dose adjustment. How often do I test? This very much depends on a variety of things, whether you're well or not. People who are well, when do I test? The answer is typically 4 times per day on test days: before breakfast, when the usual target is between 5 and 7, before lunch, when the typical target is 4 to 7, before tea, when the target's also 4 to 7, and before bed, when the usual target is between 6 and 10. Let's take a look at an example. Here's Bill. Bill's got a fair number of readings, so hopefully enough readings to guide dose adjustment. And what we're going to do is we're going to start by looking at Bill's pre-breakfast sugars. Always start with the pre-breakfast sugars. And what we're after is, what's the overall message from that column? There's usually a reading that will be a bit high or a bit low, but we're looking for the overall message. And when we look at Bill's pre-breakfast sugars, what we find is that the overall message is they're too high. There's a couple, the 6.7 and the 5.5, that are within range, but all the rest are above range. So the overall message from Bill's pre-breakfast sugars is they are too high. If we turn to Bill's pre-lunch sugars, here too, they are all above range, all too high. So what we'll do then is we'll take a look at Bill's pre-tea sugars, and what we find here is that they're mostly okay. There's one 12.1, but most of the rest are all right. So pre-tea sugars, the overall message is they're okay. And when we look at Bill's pre-bed sugars, what we find is that although there's a couple green that are in range, the vast majority of them are too low. They're outside range. So in this colour scheme, I've made it that green is that they're within range, amber is they're above range, and red means that they're predominantly too low. So Bill's pre-bed sugars, mostly too low. If we look at somebody else, here's Louise. Again, we start with Louise's pre-breakfast sugars, and what we find is that they are all too high. If we move on to Louise's pre-lunch sugars, however, we find that there are 3. Those are okay, 4.4, 6.6 and 4, but most are too low. So the overall message from Louise's pre-lunch sugars is they're too low. Turning to Louise's pre-tea sugars, although there's 1 that's okay, the overwhelming majority are too high. And the same is true for Louise's pre-bed sugars. Turning to Brian, let's have a look at Brian, and again, let's start with the pre-breakfast sugars, and what we find is they're mostly too low. So to reinforce the message, we're after the overall message that comes from the column of numbers. There's a couple there that are too high, but the vast majority are red, they're too low. If we look at Brian's pre-lunch sugars, they are also, in the main, too low. The overall message from that column is the sugars are in too tight, too low. Tea time look okay, there's 1 low and 1 a bit high, but most of them look okay, so the overall message from Brian's pre-tea sugars is they're okay. And at bedtime, too low. A couple that are within range, but 5 that are too low. Let's have a look at Chris. Again, let's look at Chris's pre-breakfast sugars. And what we find is a bit of a mixed message here. We've got a number of readings that are too high and a number of readings that are too low. And this happens sometimes, and it's difficult, and it doesn't give us a clear guide on whether the dose needs to go up or down. So what we do in this situation is we keep monitoring until that message is clear. If we just keep monitoring, and the sugars remain all over the place, it's always a dietary thing. We need to sort out the diet before we start trying to sort out the insulin. If we look at Chris's pre-lunch sugars, we find that there are 3 that are okay, but mostly they're too low. So the overall message from his pre-lunch column is the sugars are running too low. At tea time, Chris's sugars are mostly fine, all but one of them being within range. And at bedtime, again, a bit of a mixed message with too low, too high, and 3 that are within range. So again, no clarity from Chris's pre-bed monitoring. Turning to Ellie, if we cast our eye over Ellie's sugars, again starting with the pre-breakfast sugars but swiftly move across, what we find is that almost all of Ellie's sugars are okay. Yes, there's a couple that are too high, there's one that's too low, but the overall message is that Ellie's sugars are okay. So, in terms of making adjustments, where do I start? Always start by preventing frequent recurrent lows, hypos. Always prevent hypos first. So if you find that there's a day or a portion of the day where they're consistently too low, deal with that first. If recurrent hypos are not an issue, and usually they're not, always start with the pre-breakfast sugars and sort the pre-breakfast sugars first. Whilst sorting the pre-breakfast sugars, if hypos are not a problem, you can pretty much ignore all the other sugars. The next thing we need to know is which insulin acts when, because we have to know when we see a sugar, which insulin is influencing that sugar. There's lots of different ways of using insulin. Today we're going to consider just one, the basal bolus regimen, or the multi-daily injection. It's the same thing, and this is the most common way of using insulin in type 1 diabetes. In the basal bolus regimen, you take 4 injections each day. There's an injection of long-acting insulin, usually at bedtime, and injections of fast-acting insulin 10 to 20 minutes before breakfast, lunch, and tea. What reading tells us about which insulin dose? Well, the pre-breakfast sugar tells us about the bedtime long-acting insulin. Pre-lunch sugar tells us about the breakfast time insulin. Pre-tea sugar tells us about the lunchtime insulin. And the pre-bed sugar tells us about the tea time insulin. In other words, whichever sugar you look at, it's telling us about the insulin injection before that sugar. The insulin injection immediately before that sugar is the one that's reflected in the sugar. Let's go back to Bill. Now, we remember that Bill's pre-breakfast sugars are mostly running too high. And we've just established that these pre-breakfast sugars reflect Bill's bedtime long-acting insulin. Looking at Bill's pre-lunch sugars, which remember are also too high, these reflect his breakfast time insulin. Bill's tea time sugars reflect his lunchtime insulin, and Bill's bedtime insulin sugars reflect his tea time insulin. Going back to breakfast, we can see that Bill takes insulin Epidra, that's a fast-acting insulin, 22 plus 22 plus 26, 22 before his breakfast, 22 before his lunch, 26 before his evening meal, and he takes Lantus, a long-acting insulin, 60 units at bedtime. So we've established that it's Bill's bedtime long-acting insulin, which is reflected in his pre-breakfast sugars. His pre-breakfast sugars are too high, so Bill needs to increase his bedtime insulin. And what he does is he increases the Lantus from 60 units to 64. What Bill does then is he monitors for a couple of weeks. And what he finds is that his pre-breakfast sugars are improved. They're definitely better than they were, but they're still mostly out of range, mostly a bit too high. So what Bill now does is he further increases his bedtime long-acting insulin, his Lantus, from 64 units to 68 units. And then he monitors again for a couple of weeks. And at this stage, Bill now finds that most of his pre-breakfast sugars are in range. So those 2 increases to Bill's bedtime long-acting insulin have taken his pre-breakfast sugars into range. So he's gone from 60 to 64, then 64 to 68, and 68 is now right. So he can fix that dose and he can start to look at his other sugars. And what Bill does next is he moves on to the next column to his pre-lunch sugars. And in fact, although they were running high, the adjustments that Bill's made to his long-acting insulin, which have improved his pre-breakfast sugars, have also meant that his pre-lunch sugars are now also in range. So no need for Bill to change his breakfast time Ppedra. He then moves on to his pre-tea sugars, which you'll remember were fine and still are, so he doesn't need to make any changes there, which just leaves Bill to move on to Prebed. And Prebed, looking at those sugars, they're mostly below range. Remember, the target for Prebed is 6 to 10, and most of Bill's Prebed sugars are below that, 4.4, 3.9, 5.1, 5.5, 4.6. So Bill's Prebed sugars are running too low. His Prebed sugars reflect his Ttime Ppedra, his Ttime fast-acting insulin, and if the sugars are too low, he needs to reduce his Ttime insulin. You remember he's taking 22 plus 22 plus 26, so 26 at Ttime, and that's too high, he needs to take that down. So Bill reduces his Ttime fast-acting insulin, his Ttime Ppedra, from 26 to 22. He reduces it by 4 units. And then he continues to monitor. And what he now finds is that his Prebed sugars are fine. They're all in range, which is good. So Bill's sugars are now sorted. Generally, the bedtime long-acting insulin doesn't change much over time, so once it's sorted, you can leave it alone. Pre-breakfast sugars will largely stay in target. Might be an occasional one that's a bit too high or a bit too low, but mostly they'll be in target. If he's unwell for a few days, they may go up. But generally, once the bedtime insulin's sorted, you can lock it, it tends to stay the same. Ppedra doses, on the other hand, obviously can vary with what you eat, but that's the subject of another session. Thank you.